Welcome, welcome. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen. Amen.
We are now dealing with, still in the curse of Canaan and the blessings of Shem and Japheth, and we had the blessing, of Shem, all right, and now we have Yaft. Look at the play on words clearly, right? Yaft Elohim leYefet, and by the way, this word Yaft, wow. Hmm. Vayishkon be'oholei Shem, and may he dwell in the tents of Shem, right? And Vayiknan Eved Lamor, right? That's a
What does
poetic
Yaf
word.
mean?
Say that again.
What does Yaf mean? You
Oh,
said
I
look
know.
at that
I'll
word.
get to it in a second. I'm gonna riff on it a little bit, okay?
Okay.
Just to finish the sentence, right? And let Canaan be a servant, a slave. Lamor is a poetic form of lahem, to them, right? May be a slave to them. All right. So before we get into the Rashi, because Rashi, you can see, zooms right into it, right? So Yaft, I think comes from the word Yafeh. I think this is so cool, actually, right? Because Yefet represents Europe, right? And of course, we know the degree to which Greek civilization has influenced, we call Western civilization, right? Basically, the civilization of Europe, which is west of Asia. And the word Yafeh means beautiful. And we know that the theory of aesthetics and beauty was a profound focus of Greek thinking. How the golden square or the golden triangle or whatever. I mean, these whole ideas of relationships and ratios and stuff. But the idea of aesthetics and beauty was so important to Greek civilization. And here's this word, yafeh, which means beautiful, which I suspect, this material way came way earlier than that. But still, just the interesting connection there. This isn't the direction Rashi's going to go into, and I'm going to go right into the Rashi now. But I just can't help being, sort of smiling at the fact that Yefet comes from a word Yafer, which means beautiful. So and again, when you sort of meditate on these things, what exactly is it? What is beauty is significant, and in what is beautiful? What exactly do we mean when we say it? Is it has a relationship? I don't want to riff too much more, but just open some questions, right? So Rashi goes to the Targum and he says, Yefet, miturgam Yefet, yarchiv, right? He says that the Aramaic understanding of this word Yefet, you notice in the Aramaic, Yafteh, right, means yarchiv, broaden, to make large. And of course, again, if we talk about enlarging and enlarging the sphere of influence, right, look at the degree to which Greek civilization has influenced Western civilization. I mean, it's basically one and the same. Just profound. Okay. Vayishkon ba'olei Shem, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem. Okay. So, Yashre Shchinato Yisrael, right? So here what we're saying is may the divine presence, I believe is what he's talking about. May the divine presence rest upon Israel. In other words, as opposed to in Yefet. Umidrash Chachamim, and there is in our earlier sources, right? We have it says Af al pi sheyeft Elohim leyefet, that despite the fact that God has broadened the sphere of influence, will go with that Aramaic translation, right? Made Yefet so important. Why? Or as we could say, beautified, if we want to go that way, I think we could. Why? In what sense? Shebana Koresh, because Koresh, Cyrus, built Shaya. Okay, so he built the temple, the second temple. Koresh, Cyrus, remember when the Jews came back from that exile in Babylonia, Cyrus allowed them to go ahead and made it possible for them to build the second temple. And as he points out, Shahaya mibnei Yefet, Koresh was a descendant, right? He was one of the Japhethites, right? He was from Yefet. And that is, of course, very often Iranians, Persia is considered Aryan, okay, which is from that part. It's not Asian, right? Shayabi Yefet Bayit Sheni. He built the second temple. Lo Sharta Bo Shechina. However, the divine presence did not rest in that second temple the way it had rested in the first temple. So this is the way the sages are understanding the sentence, meaning, in other words, let God, let's just for the sake of translation, let God beautify Yefet, or let God allow Yefet to act in a very profound kind of way. But God, Elohim, the subject, right? But he will dwell in the tents of Shem. And the tents of Shem referring to the great tent, that is the temple. So that's how the rabbis are parsing this particular sentence here. Okay? Let's keep going with the sentence of Rashi, right? Vehechan shata. So where did the divine presence rest? B'mikdash Rishon, in the first sanctuary, Shebana Shlomo, which Solomon built, Shaya Mibnei Shem, who was a descendant of Shem. Interesting way in which this is parsed out. So yes, Cyrus is given credit for building that second temple, but nevertheless, it was as magnificent and as profoundly important it was, and beautiful too, by the way. Okay, we have representations and descriptions and pictures of it, right? Nevertheless, the divine presence didn't rest there, but it did in the first temple. And we have stories and narratives in the book of Kings that describe it, right? Going on, Vahik Nan Eved, right? And may Canaan be a servant or a slave to them. Af mi shi galu Shem. Interesting, right? Even though the descendants of Shem will go into exile, they no longer will live in their land. Im karu lahem avadim. Servants, slaves will be sold to them, mibnei Canaan, from the descendants of Canaan. I don't have a lot more information about this. I am obviously, these are kinds of sentences. The whole notion of slavery is one that I find pretty hard to deal with. The difference is that a slave, you own the person, right? The slave is owned by another person, as opposed to someone who works for another person. A servant isn't necessarily a slave. What they are buying is your labor, but they're not buying you. There's a distinction. And exactly, I mean, we see here, of course, we realize that in the Torah, the concept of slavery is something that is dealt with, all right? But I will tell you that in general, the way in which the tradition has handled it really seems to move against the notion of slavery. Some of it involved in the fact that, for example, male slaves are to be circumcised, which means that they now are partially already Jewish. And there is no such thing as one Jew totally owning another person. The truth is that another approach to this, which I personally like, is to see this more as metaphoric and talking about elements within the human being that we have to deal with, right? And whether this has to do metaphorically, and again, you can't move too far away from the basic meaning, even though the metaphor may be you may find the metaphor very appealing. I'll give you one example where I think the metaphor may in fact be the pshat, and that is the whole story of the slavery of the Israelites in Egypt and what Pharaoh represents, because I think it represents that every person has a Pharaoh within themselves. And if you look at the kind of language that Pharaoh uses and his arrogance and his behavior, etc. Every person, I think, so many of us have to deal with personal arrogance and how negative that is. And slavery, I've mentioned already, it seemed to me that it's a commentary on addiction and how we try to get rid of addiction within ourselves. So whether Canaan represents certain kinds of character flaws within every human being, that there's Canaan within all of us. And we have to be able to, Canaan, I would say, to use a more modern terminology, is the elephant, right? And whether or not the example of our relationship of our rational side to our emotional side. The rational side of us is a rider, and the emotional side is the elephant. And the question is, what do we allow to be in control in our own personalities? Do we let the elephant take over and control our behavior? In which case, how powerful and how damaging an elephant can be, or can the rider control that elephant? So it's one possible way to go to say that, in a sense, that part of us that is Canaan needs to be a slave to that other part of us. Yes, Judith.
When you're talking about the rider and the elephant,
Yes.
um, where does God fit into this?
Um,
And
good
trusting
question.
in God,
Right,
casting
right.
your burdens on God, things
Yes,
like that.
exactly. I don't believe it's part of it, and I can't think of whether it's a psychotherapist or somebody the person who came up with this particular example. But I wish I knew. It is a person who has a name, whose name I cannot think of right now. Um, but no, I would say that that particular model does not include a transcendent level to it. That is something that clearly the Bible brings in and tries to help us develop that. And we also know is it the 12-step program? That very early on,
Yes.
you have to say that there is some external, transcendent, ultimately powerful force that can help me conquer this addiction. Right. But
Sometimes it's the
yeah,
community. It's
well,
that fellowship of fellow travelers,
I think
which
that
is,
yes. Sorry, I'm interrupting you.
yeah.
Yes. No, no, no. Okay. Please understand, though, if you are willing to allow for a transcendent reality, who creates that community ultimately? What creates the dynamics that allow that community to form, et cetera, et cetera? Ultimately, it all boils down to a divine, transcendent, cause. So regardless, yes, no question about the importance of, fellow human beings to help support one, but who created those fellow human beings? Okay. But also the idea that there has to be something even beyond that. The community isn't always, at your beck and call. Unfortunately, it isn't. Yes, Judith, please. Did you want to add? Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm going back to Eved as slave,
Right.
servant, and
Right.
service of God.
Yes. No, this is referring to slave here. If I'm not sure if you're talking about the metaphor or you're talking about or you're talking about the pshat. It's talking about Canaan being slave. Remember, he's already mentioned this before, which is the idea of Canaan having to serve, and Ham, who's I believe, let's see, grandfather, or father, his father, to Japheth and Shem. So he's echoing that particular sentiment. But so yeah, I'm sorry. So if you want to, maybe I need to hear your question again, and so I
No,
can
that's
get
fine.
a better sense
That's
of
fine.
it.
That's fine.
All right. Okay. So,
Yep.
but what this is saying, what the Rashi is saying is that despite the fact that Shem is going to go into exile, and exile means you now come under the control of others. We know the Jewish people went into exile, although they didn't go into exile into Africa. They went into exile as in, well, North Africa, but basically it's under the Romans. The Romans would have been Japheth, right? The Romans were descendants of, they were Europeans. So anyway, just some different thoughts there. Let's take a look and see. I think we have a onto this. Here we go. Vaychi Noach achar Mabul. Noah lived after the flood. Shlosh me'ot shana. He lived 300 years. V'chamishim shana, and 50 years. He lived another 350 years after the flood. Let's take a look. And we finish up this chapter with Vahi Chol Yemei Noach. And so Noah, his entire life, Shah Me'ot Shana, 900 years, V'chamishim Shana, and 50 years, Vayamot, and he died. His life came to an end. He was 600 years old when the flood occurred, and he lived another 350 years. We are told earlier on that he was 600 when the flood occurred. So I know I've probably talked about this before, but it is something that is so striking. I'm going to talk about it again. That is the length of years that people were alive. This is a very common subject. Right. And of course, no one comes even close to these kind of years nowadays. And if one wants to, what is the Bible saying here? Okay, so here is my thought. I just was actually, because we're dealing with Genesis in the synagogue at this time, a companion said to me, well, he'd read somewhere where if you, instead of saying years, you say months, of course, it brings down the number of years considerably. You divide them by 12 and you don't get even close, right? You come to more realistic. And I said, I'm not crazy about that. I don't think it's right. Okay. And let me explain why. I have two supporting ideas behind this, that the Torah wants us to understand that people lived this long back then. Not that we have to believe that it actually happened. And this is my point about seeing the Bible as literature. The Bible has a point. In other words, I'm not saying that it's fiction per se, but in a way, the usage of fiction is that it tells us it's a way to express very, very deep truths about life and human personality and things like that in a way that we will be able to process, where simple, straightforward, didactic, expression doesn't do it. And so, what are we saying? What's the Bible trying to say? The Bible's trying to say that all these people lived this incredible amount of time. Not a single one, not even Methuselah, lived 1,000 years. And of course, in Psalm 90, we say 1,000 years is like a day in the eyes of God. So again, despite the fact that people are so long-lived, regardless, their lives come to an end. They are mortal, no matter how long they live. So I think that is the point that the Torah is trying to make on one level, that no matter how long a person lives, it's not forever. And of course, people behave as if they're going to live forever. They're not. Okay, that's number one. Number two, as to why the Torah, I believe, really wants you to understand these as years, is because at some point, God has said he's not going to allow people to live so long. And he brings it all the way down in this parsha of Noach to 120 years. Now, if they weren't living that long to begin with, where's the threat? If they're not living that long. In fact, if you start dividing by 12, right, you don't get anywhere close. So the whole point is lost. There's no point then of saying that God decided to shorten the lives of human beings. And so I think the Torah wants us to understand these people actually did live, whether it was just the people mentioned by name, whether everybody was living such a long time. And I tend to believe the second because God says people, not just these individuals, but people will not live so long anymore. It's a commentary on what are you doing with your life? In other words, you can live 900 years and not accomplish a single thing, right? Simply live for yourself and exist. Or you can spend 50 years or 30 years and accomplish incredible things. You look at someone like Mozart, who died in his 30s, and look at the legacy of music that Mozart left. It's not a question of how many years, it's a question of what do you do at that time? And the Torah wants us to understand that, right? Some very profoundly important individuals did not live very long, okay? And in all traditions, and the Torah wants us to understand that it's not a matter of simply living long lives, okay? And I think that's really an important message for us to realize. I think there are other messages as well. I don't know that I'm going to riff on them right this second, but I think it is absolutely something to think about. I can think of one other thing. Look, is it possible that people live that long? I think maybe the Torah is also saying that ultimately, given the fact that different creatures and different species live for different lengths of time, in a sense, we're saying they are programmed by the Transcendent One to live so long, right? There are parrots that live, tortoises, that live hundreds of years, etc., as I understand it. And the whole question of aging is, in fact, a fascinating topic and one, a great puzzle as to why certain things don't live that long and why other things live for a long, long time. And I think we have some answers, but they're not complete answers. One, I believe people in the Himalayas routinely live into past 100 years old. I don't think anybody there lives to 900, but at least over 100. And part of the reason is that the air there is pure. In other words, impurities can definitely shorten our lives. The other piece is that exercise. I mean, they live in the mountain areas. They're walking up and down mountains all the time. They're exercising, and we know diet, exercise, all kinds of things can have an effect. But we also know ultimately it's a genetic issue, all right? Has to do with much deeper kinds of things. So I do not have any need to go deeply into scientific evidence that people actually live this long. The point is being made. Yeah. Me, did you want to say something? Or Judith? Was any reaction to this? Okay.
No,
So,
I appreciated it.
yeah, okay. Thank you. I am going to stop here for now. We came to the end of a chapter, and we'll start chapter 10. Afterwards, it's essentially, you'll see that it's, I believe, a genealogy about the many nations that came. And on Friday, we'll start this and take a look at it and see about it. So,
Very good.
okay. So I'll
Okay.
stop
Enjoy
it.
the riff.